Good morning, everyone. We'll give people a few moments to join and then we'll begin this webinar. We'll just get started in about 30 seconds. Just give a few more people time to join. Good morning, everyone. I can see that we still have some participants joining, but I'd like to get started if we can this morning or the afternoon, or maybe even the evening, wherever you are. Welcome. I'm Rachel Stoll, Vice President at the Stimson Center, and I'm really delighted to welcome you today and to have us partner with the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs and the International Human Rights Clinic from Harvard Law School on not only this project, but this event today. And I'm really pleased to see how diverse an audience we have registered for this event today. When I looked through the RSVPs, I saw many arms experts, government officials, colleagues from civil society organizations, the ICRC, all sort of in the room, as it were. And we're really grateful for the engagement and energy that exists around this topic and are looking forward to a really exciting conversation today. A few housekeeping things before we begin. You will see there is a Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please, throughout the presentations, put your questions in that section and we'll have time to answer them after the presenters are finished with their presentations. I want to start with just a little background about why we're here and what this topic is about. The Arms Trade Treaty, which entered into force in 2014, is the first legally binding treaty to regulate the cross-border trade in conventional arms. And it really resulted from the challenges that governments faced in dealing with the consequences of the unregulated global arms trade. The continued human rights suffering, the human rights violations, the violence against civilians made urgent the need to develop a global framework to regulate the trade in conventional arms. The ATT just nearly 7 years later has 110 states parties and 31 signatories. The Arms Trade Treaty is particularly noteworthy and really why we're here today, because it is the first legally binding global instrument to recognize and create obligations around the connections between arms transfers and gender-based violence. Given that the ATT is groundbreaking in its incorporation of GBV, it's unsurprising that new tools, different sources of data, and the development of GBV expertise are required to effectively implement the provisions in the treaty. Civil society has really been a leader in pushing the implementation of the ATT GBV provision and has been producing guidance for states for some time now. And I want to particularly commend our partners from WILP, Control Arms, the Harvard International Human Rights Clinic, the ICRC, UNIDIR, and Small Arms Survey for their amazing contributions to this work. And I'm particularly gratified that Stimson is also playing a role in this effort. So I'm going to let Verity speak to why this project now, what the project was, and how we organized our work. But from the wider Stimson perspective, I want to say one of, I think, our strengths as Stimson, and indeed what makes me most proud of the work that we do, is that we really are a do tank, not just a think tank. We do think the big thoughts, and when you read this report, you're going to see some really good ideas, But we also want to make those ideas practical and implementable. So equipping licensing officials, for example, with tools like this paper and the associated questionnaire so they can effectively implement the ATT, which will ultimately reduce human suffering, is really a practical application that we're very proud to be driving forward with such fabulous partners. So you can imagine how pleased we are to have the support of the Irish government and its Department of Foreign Affairs behind this effort. Ireland has long been a leader in this area, and it is an international gender champion, has been extremely vocal and active throughout the ATT process and in meetings, and is consistent in their approach to support work in this area. And now, as a member of the UN Security Council, Ireland has an even bigger stage to showcase their good works in this area. So I'd like to welcome Emma Tobin from the Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to make some opening remarks. Emma, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you for the kind words also. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all colleagues, depending on the time zone. Ireland was really pleased to be able to fund and support the preparation of the report being launched today by Stimson on the ATT and GBV. Gender-based violence is a horizontal, cross-cutting issue, and effectively addressing it is key to helping achieve gender equality, sustainable development, and lasting peace and security. This need to address GBV has been reflected in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the UN Secretary General's Agenda for Disarmament, and most prominently, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, of which Ireland is a vocal champion. The proliferation of small arms is strongly correlated with gender-based violence. In implementing effective export controls on arms, states can help stop the perpetuation of gender-based violence, and the ATT is crucial in achieving this. The report being launched today provides states with tangible, pragmatic tools to aid in our export risk assessments. Most importantly, as already referred to by Rachel, this report builds and adds value on the previous work done in this area, specifically by drawing on the discussions had in recent years between states and with civil society, and engaging directly with licensing officers to develop specific guidance for officials on conducting GBV risk assessments. Colleagues will be aware that overlaps between GBV and the arms trade have featured prominently ever since the first negotiations on what would become the ATT. The different gendered impacts of armed conflict on women, men, boys, and girls is a critical consideration. For example, while men make up most direct casualties from the use of small arms and light weapons, such weapons are often used to facilitate acts of gender-based violence against women and girls, resulting in long-term physical, psychological, and socioeconomic harm. We've seen time and time again that there are strong correlations between illicit arms flows in non-conflict settings and the rate of violence and intimidation against women. The inclusion of a direct reference to gender-based violence and arms in the preamble of the treaty and in Article 7.4 was a historic achievement, and it marked the first time GBV was explicitly referenced in an arms-related treaty. Its inclusion signified a formal recognition by the state parties of the disproportionate gendered impacts on armed violence and conflict. Its inclusion also rectified a lack of an explicit reference to GBV in the UN POA on small arms, and aligned the ATT with UN Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. Gender-based violence can present in a myriad of different ways in risk assessments. It can be both overt, through visible patterns in honor killings, and discreet, through repression and threat. Underreporting is systemic in all countries. So the feasibility of establishing GBV-specific assessments and export regimes is challenging due to the discrete nature of certain GBV violations and a lack of data. And this underscores the need for qualitative, informed assessments of export license applications, end users, and destination countries. Being able to identify patterns or assess GBV risks in a given license is not only mandated by the treaty, but it's also vital in helping to combat GBV against women, girls, men, and boys. Additionally, the application of a gender perspective can also help shed light on human rights infringements, which may not be immediately obvious to the assessor. Since 2017, following Ireland's submission of a working paper and recommendations calling on states parties to enhance the implementation of Article 7.4, Ireland, ATT states parties, and civil society have been engaged in discussions on GBV risk assessments, information exchanges, and the development of appropriate guidance documents. The thematic focus of the 5th Conference of State Parties was on gender and gender-based violence, and Ireland was pleased to work with the Latvian presidency throughout the CSP as the vice president of the meeting. At this meeting, the states adopted a decision on GBV which contains a number of actions that should be taken forward in the ATT context, including on implementing gender-based violence risk assessments as per Article 7.4 of the treaty. So the launch of today's report is a culmination of this proactive engagement. It draws on Stimson's and Harvard's expertise in this area and represents tangible, specific guidance on GBV risk assessments in the context of the ATT. Crucially, this guidance was developed through engagement with licensing officials directly and with their specific needs and resources in mind in order to be practical and practicable. The development of the questionnaire is universally applicable for all state parties and can help standardize the practice of looking specifically at GBV risks in the day-to-day processing of license applications. The effective implementation of Article 7.4 is a proof of concept, and it can demonstrate that tangible GBV risk provisions can and should be included in future international agreements. This report provides a baseline for how any further GBV risk assessments can be applied in a variety of different contexts. So I'm really excited to hear Verity and Anna talk us through the report and the assessment process. So having spoken for probably too long, I'm going to end my remarks there and hand back to Rachel. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Emma. And that was an excellent introduction of the history of the work in this field in terms of how the ATT process has addressed this issue. And I think I will just turn over for the big reveal of the report and the questionnaire to our authors, Verity Coyle and Anna Crow, who can share the details about the project and its output. Verity is a non-resident fellow here at Stimson, and Anna is assistant director of the International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School. And it's been an absolute pleasure to partner with Harvard for this project. And so I will turn it over to Verity and Anna to share the results of all of our work.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Emma. I could see myself on the screen nodding away with so much of what you were saying. And yes, I think there are several other processes underway at the moment that we should probably talk about separately to this event, where I feel exactly the same. This precedent has been set now, and we need to expand it into other pieces of new international law as they're being developed. So that was exciting to hear. And thank you, all of you, for attending. It's already been said, we know that some of you have got up very early to be here, and for some of you it is very late. It's really heartening to see the attendance at this event today and the interest in the project and the topic. There are many government officials from a variety of roles in the room. Some of you I've worked closely with, some of you I hope to meet when in-person meetings are a thing again. Lots of civil society colleagues who I deeply admire are on the RSVP list too. And as Rachel said, the ICRC that plays a vital role in understanding and unpicking this work is here. So thank you all for coming. I'd also like to quickly thank the Government of Ireland for funding the project, letting us do this work. Not just a gender champion in name or on paper, but through your actions and statements in the Arms Trade Treaty and in other spaces. And we first met to discuss this project with your representatives in Geneva in 2020 in the margins of an ATT meeting. Little did we know that that was going to be our last in-person meeting for now over a year. As researchers, we often conduct our interviews remotely. That is not uncommon. But what we also normally have to draw on are the conversations around the meetings after the meetings, the formal debates that run into informal spaces where views and information can be exchanged in a more relaxed and human way. That wasn't possible throughout the entirety of this project, but I do want to thank all of the governments that did engage with our remote interview process and submitted information in writing. By sharing information about licensing processes, your understanding of gender-based violence and the national level implementation of the ATT, you allowed us to look to draw from best practice and also identify potential gaps that could be supported by this type of project. I also want to start with a little bit of backstory though, and place this work in context before Anna, who led the team from Harvard and co-authored the paper and questionnaire, will take us through the content. And then I'm going to come back and talk about how we hope this will be used and ultimately the change we hope it will assist to make. And the point I want to make about giving you some backstory about the creation of this Article 7.4 in the Arms Trade Treaty is to demonstrate the energy and desire that existed to set this new international normative and operational framework. It existed both within civil society and within the United Nations. And in a meeting just a few days ago, the brilliant Alison Pitlack from Women's International League for Peace and Freedom took colleagues through a whistle-stop tour about the establishment of the Arms Trade Treaty, and it really brought back some memories. She spoke about the Million Faces petition that was delivered to the UNSG at the time, Kofi Annan, by the civil society coalition Control Arms. And that shows you that this is quite an old project, because in 2008, 1 million faces on a petition or signatures was a really big deal. It demonstrated mass global opinion in a way that with the introduction of digital campaigning, that landscape has now changed forever. The other side of the coin was the determination of many governments to negotiate and agree this treaty. There were multiple years of resolutions, groups of governmental expert meetings, preparatory and negotiating conferences. And it took some doing, but when it did pass, it passed with 154 states in favour, 23 abstentions and only 3 against, and the ATT was created. When it came to be a thing, when it was created, it contained within it its articles, something unique in international law, Article 7.4, that as part of its regulation of international arms transfers, requires states parties to consider the risk that an arms export could be used to commit or facilitate gender-based violence, a form of violence perpetrated against individuals because of their gender or sex, which takes place in every part of the world. This innovation is commendable. It was hard won, and civil society and states campaigned in a sustained and dogmatic way throughout the entire negotiations to ensure that that piece of text, that new idea, remained in the final version of the treaty. So as Rachel said, it's not a surprise that when something new is created, new guidance and support will be needed to ensure it can be effectively understood and implemented. So this project in particular. Much work has been carried out on the issue of GBV and the ATT now, and that is brilliant to see. When we get to the Q&A session, I'm going to drop some links into the chat that will give you additional resources by Control Arms, WILF, the ICRC, UNIDIR, Small Arms Survey, and the International Gender Champions. I know that these will be very familiar to some of you in the room, but for those who aren't familiar with them and would like to know more, these are all brilliant resources that I can recommend as further reading. When I was working at Control Arms before becoming a non-resident fellow at Stimson, we developed a practical guide that focused on how to use the ATT to address gender-based violence. And we used that as part of a training course for officials in Latvia and Riga in 2019. We worked with, and there's 2 things about that event that I want to kind of reference here. So one, we worked with a group of officials, some who were very experienced, had been in their roles for many years, and others that were brand new as licensing officers and to their work with the ATT. The issues we were talking about, gender and gender-based violence, can be uncomfortable and challenging for some. Individuals' understanding of them is shaped by the society that they live in, their own lived experience, and the dominant political ideology that is the ultimate decision maker for their area of work. One participant shared on the first day their own personal experience of living in a fragile state where the proliferation of small arms was high government stockpiles had been pillaged, and it appeared that most men from their teenage years onwards had access to these weapons. The impact on the country, and in particular women and girls in that country, was devastating. Education became impossible because of the threat of GBV girls would face while travelling to and from school. Young friends experienced sexual violence by armed perpetrators, and many more sadly just simply disappeared. Before the widespread availability of arms, these types of GBV were not prevalent in the country. Now, while arms are not always responsible for the threat or prevalence of gender-based violence, there is a clear link between the risk of GBV and the use or availability of weapons. This has been recognised by states in several processes, including the POA reports to UNGA. The second is that whereas we worked with the officials, and this was borne out in the interviews we conducted for this project too, is that the sources licensing officials go to for their inquiries are often other government departments or overseas embassies. So the understanding of gender-based violence and the way arms can be used to commit or facilitate them by those sources is vitally important if we are to capture the range of gender-based violence that can be committed or facilitated by arms and the potential risk by a proposed transfer. So this project is a response to all of that. If we accept that gender-based violence is often underreported and less visible than other violations, then it naturally follows that without detailed and separate analysis of gender-based violence risks, elements of concern that may not be captured in a more general human rights analysis can remain consistently overlooked or minimised. How we can better support licensing officers and their information sources in obtaining the best information relevant to a GBV risk assessment, thereby enabling governments to make well-informed decisions. I believe that the ATT is a critical contribution to global efforts to address gender-based violence and is a further step in broader UN efforts to mainstream gender issues into global policy and practice. We're delighted to be playing a part in that, as Rachel said, hopefully in a really practical way. And now I'm going to hand over to Anna and let her explain the content of the paper. Thanks.
Thank you, Verity. I'd like to also extend my thanks to the Stimson Centre for being such a fantastic partner on this project and to the Government of Ireland for its support. And I'd also like to give a special thanks to the students in the International Human Rights Clinic, Simon, Laura and Zarko, who worked so diligently on this project in the fall of last year. So I'll give a bit of an overview of the questionnaire itself. But first, I wanted to start with a few brief words about Article 7.4 and how it fits within the larger framework of the treaty. So I know many of you listening today or watching today are very familiar with the Arms Trade Treaty, but for those who are less familiar, Article 7, in which this provision appears, requires states to undertake an assessment whenever an export is proposed of the risks that arms could be used to commit or facilitate serious violations of international human rights law or international humanitarian law, alongside other considerations. And whenever there is an overriding risk, they must deny that export. And Article 7 itself complements Article 6 of the treaty, which absolutely prohibits transfers, so not just exports in particular circumstances, as well as Article 11, which requires states involved in transfers to take measures to prevent their diversion. So the questionnaire appears as the first part of a report that has three parts. The first part is the questionnaire itself. It's relatively short. It just comprises 10 questions in total in the three areas here in the screen, and I'll speak more about those in a second. Part 2 is an explanatory guide, which provides contextualized examples in relation to each question, as well as an outline of the terms and concepts used in the questionnaire. And Part 3 contains questions for licensing officers, which are organised in parallel to the questions for information sources. And I guess just a quick note, as Verity said, the term information sources that we're using here refers really to anyone that a licensing officer seeks information from. And most often those would be officials within the government of the licensing official, but they could be officials in other governments or in intergovernmental organisations as well. A couple of other general notes are that the questionnaire assumes an information source is within the licensing officer's own government, and it's important to note that these aren't questions that are designed to be posed to the state receiving the export, to the recipient state, but more to information sources within the government of the licensing official or of a regional organisation or intergovernmental organisation. And as Verity mentioned, the questionnaire and the report as a whole aims to supplement the existing guidance that she's shared today. So turning to the questionnaire itself, part A contains 3 questions. And the goal of this set of questions is to help a licensing officer who's examining an application to understand the exporter and end user's human rights records, which can help them to then make a preliminary determination about the level of scrutiny that an application might merit. The answers to the questions in this section, which are broader than GBV, should of course inform and be informed by the more general human rights assessment that the licensing officer is undertaking to comply with Article 7 and Article 6 more broadly. So the first question asks whether the information source knows whether any government has denied an export license because of the human rights record of the exporter or end user of the proposed export, or any close associate of the end user or exporter, and if so, why that denial was made. The second question asks the information source to examine public information or information held by their department on the human rights record of the exporter or end user, and to evaluate whether that information demonstrates compliance with human rights obligations or not. And the last question asks the same regarding close associates of exporters and end users. So as you know, end users are frequently military actors, police, or other entities with links to these groups. And when the end user is a state actor, it carries with it the human rights obligations of that state. Exporters, as businesses, also have a responsibility to respect human rights. For the exporting state, the answers to these questions not only help licensing officials to identify problematic actors, but also reinforce the exporting state's obligation to ensure that businesses operating in their territory, including arms exporters, themselves exercise human rights due diligence. The second set of questions, part B, is on the general situation in the recipient state as it relates to gender-based violence. And the goal of this section is to assist licensing officers to understand any conditions in the recipient state relevant to GBV, to allow them to build an overall picture of the situation before they assess the possible consequences of the specific export that they're looking at. So the first question asks the information source to assess the extent and severity of GBV, both prior and current, in the recipient state. Gender-based violence, as Verity and Emma both mentioned, is violence directed against a person on the basis of their gender and sex. And importantly, as the questionnaire outlines, it can take a number of different forms. It can be physical, sexual, psychological, or socioeconomic. And it's really important that information sources don't reach only just for the most obvious examples of GBV, but consider the overall situation across these 4 types. So starting with physical GBV, let's say that an information source knows that honour killings are prevalent in the recipient state. So honour killings are a form of physical GBV because they are physical violence that specifically targets women because of their sex. With this knowledge, the information source should then provide contextual information about honour killings alongside strictly numeric statistics. For example, an information source could detail who the agents of honour killings are, their relationship to victims, and how the government and legal system of the recipient state is responding. Sexual GBV, which includes the acts listed here on the slide, is another form of GBV that information sources ought to research. An example of relevant information on sexual GBV in the recipient state would be, and perhaps the most obvious example would be, government statistics or surveys on the prevalence of sexual violence. But as with physical GBV, it's not just about statistics, but also contextual information that helps the licensing officer to build a picture of the overall situation. So the example on the screen here, that there's a government study on rampant sexual violence against boys by police, would be a piece of information that an information source could include in their answer to this question on the extent and severity of GBV. And as a side note, as has already been mentioned, it's important to acknowledge that GBV can be directed against men and boys and not just women and girls. So psychological GBV includes any act or behaviour that causes psychological harm to the victim, such as emotional abuse and controlling behaviour. And intimate partner violence often entails both physical and psychological violence, but it's important to know that psychological violence can, of course, occur completely independently of physical violence or any other forms of GBV. Finally, socioeconomic violence can occur on a personal level, such as when one abusive spouse limits the other spouse's financial resources to deny them independence or cause economic hardship. But it can also occur at a systemic or societal level, such as when a country maintains laws that deny equal inheritance rights on the basis of sex. Question 2 in part B asks the information source to consider factors in the recipient state that would contribute to underreporting or issues with GBV statistics, which, as Emma mentioned, is a very significant issue in this area. So, for example, a report may characterise data on convictions for rape in the recipient state as representing the prevalence of rape in the country, but the actual prevalence is obviously going to be higher because not all rapes are reported to the police or brought to trial or charged or result in convictions. So that's the type of information that the information source should provide an answer to the second question. And the answers here assist the licensing officer to comprehend the degree of GBV underreporting and thereby make more realistic predictions about the potential for future gender-based violence linked to the export. Question 3 speaks to the role that the state itself plays in setting general legal and cultural frameworks around GBV. So an information source responding to question 3 should examine both GBV committed by state agents and whether the state has failed to meet its obligation to prevent, investigate and punish GBV by private actors. A robust legal framework, for example, could indicate a commitment to preventing GBV, but if that framework isn't well implemented and exists only on paper, it's going to have a limited effect. So that's the type of information that would be relevant in answer to this question. Finally, the part C is getting to the nub of the issue, the connection between the export and the GBV risks, and it's taking into account the information that the information source has provided in the previous sections as well. So the first question asks whether the type of conventional arms in the proposed export has been used to commit or facilitate GBV in the recipient state in the past, and that includes all 4 types of GBV that I have just outlined. For example, if the exporter has applied to export battle tanks, how have battle tanks been implicated in GBV in the recipient state? The most direct link between conventional arms and GBV exists when arms themselves are directly used to inflict harm. For example, conventional arms may be used to kill or injure individuals. And when those individuals are targeted on the basis of gender or sex, that violence constitutes GBV. However, arms can also be used to commit GBV without even being discharged, such as the use of weapons to threaten, intimidate, or coerce individuals. Arms can also be used to facilitate GBV, which just means that rather than being directly involved in the commission of GBV, they make the act easier. And facilitation can encompass a wide range of acts, in some cases, several steps removed from the harm itself. So in this example of facilitation, an export application covers armed combat vehicles, and reports indicate that vehicles of that nature are used to transport female prisoners to a detention facility where rape and other forms of sexual violence are known to be prevalent. So the second question here asks if there is information linking the end user to the commission or facilitation of the type of GBV, of any type of GBV. And then if there is information linking the end user to GBV, a follow-up question is whether the type of arms in the proposed export was involved. The third question is what relationships the end user has with known perpetrators of GBV in the recipient state, and whether there are risks that the export could end up in the hands of these perpetrators. And the final question is a catch-all, whether there are factors that, in the view of the information source, increase or decrease the likelihood that the export could be used to commit or facilitate GBV in the recipient state. So examples would include recent military leadership changes, planned trainings of the end user, or shifts in the political landscape. So that's an overview of the questionnaire and the report itself, and I'll hand back to Verity now.
Thanks very much, Anna. I think it's always lovely to hear you talk about the work, and I know that to put kind of the last year of work into a 10-minute presentation is not particularly easy at all, so thank you for doing such a good job on that. We wanted to give an overview of the paper, but then also spend a little bit of time talking about how we can use it. And I think there are two main kind of audiences for this paper, each with a little bit of subsections below them. The first is definitely the licensing officers, and we will be working our hardest to get it into the hands of as many of them as possible. If you are a licensing officer here at the event, please do download the paper, share it with your colleagues. When we were developing it, we had this idea that you would be able to just kind of rip out the questionnaire page and stick it next to your computer and have it in mind as you were going through your daily work. Through interviewing so many of you and talking to you at various ATT meetings over the last few years, one of the things that I keep coming back to is how much you have on your plate. Like, the workload of every licensing officer I've spoken to is dramatically high. And you have to look for ways to streamline your processes, to still do that detailed, rigorous risk assessment. But maybe getting used to using tools like this would be a way where these questions get asked as a matter of course, rather than something that is not done in a detailed and systematic way at the moment. The other part of this is the section that goes to your information sources. And linked to this, I guess we want to think about, in the human rights training that all of these staff members have around the world, what level of detail is given to gender-based violence? How are they trained to spot it and acknowledge it within a country when, as all of the speakers have shared, gender-based violence is often more insidious, it is definitely underreported? How do they work with civil society in the country, understand where to be looking for it, who to be looking at as perpetrators, so that that information is at their fingertips if an export inquiry comes across their desk for a particular country, the end user within that country. The other set of audience for this paper is civil society. So by using these questions, is there a way that you can present your information better to governments to help them understand the danger a proposed transfer might pose in terms of gender-based violence within your country? You all know that you have to do no harm when you gather this information, and that in itself poses more challenges about collecting it and delivering it in a way that it can be used by governments when they're making their decisions. But there are so many good resources out there. Lots of your organisations are so skilled at this. You've been doing it for decades. My encouragement is just to do more. I think that if the information is continually put in front of those information sources and in front of the government officials who make these decisions, we would see less transfers being granted and some being actually stopped on the basis of GBV harm. So those are the two main sets of audience we have in mind for this paper. We are looking forward to opportunities to discuss it at various ATT meetings. We would be very open to invitations to come and talk to national teams about their processes. We'd love to hear more about export licensing processes around the world. Please bring us in, have those conversations. This is a practical tool, like Rachel said. We want to help, we want to inspire best practice. And the other thing that I wanted to say is how, and this is, I guess, a question to the government officials in the room, how are you going to deal with countries where you already have an open license relationship? Were these in place before the ATT and its GBV requirement came into force? Can you still demonstrate that you have fully taken into account this risk if it was not part of your thinking when those open licenses were established in the first place? Because there are a lot of transfers out there that don't go through the risk assessment process because of these relationships. And I wouldn't want us to be missing some of the harm that is being done by those transfers. And maybe this is an opportunity to take a step back and think about assessing them all with a GBV lens before continuing. I'll hand it back to Rachel.
Thank you, Verity. And Anna, I think our audience can see the enormous amount of work that has gone into this project over the last year. And I do promise that we can print copies of this report so we can have that tear out page, which it was designed to have, that we can distribute when we finally are able to meet in person. But if people do want to have that pull-out page, you can print off the website for now. You can print the report and have that page separately on your board next to your phone and your computer as you are talking with information sources. I want to remind our audience that they can use the Q&A function to ask questions to the panelists. I would like to just start with a question of my own, because I think it's very clear, and you've referenced all of the interviews that were undertaken for this project. And I know that you spoke with many different governments with different experiences in export licensing and different processes. And I'm wondering if you can share any good practices that you learned from that process that can perhaps serve as some initial guidance for other states who are looking to develop those processes themselves.
Well, thanks, Rachel. So what was interesting, and I think that this first struck us when we were at the Riga training that Control Arms organised in 2019, is that there isn't so much of a kind of step-by-step process that governments take. It's a holistic human rights assessment that they're looking for when they launch an inquiry. And this might only work for governments with more resources and a bigger kind of export business that they're working with, because it is quite intensive. But I was struck by the level of detail within the Canadian export framework. They use a heat mapping system and have a particular heat map in place for assessing gender-based violence risks. We would have loved to have seen that heat map and what the kind of parameters of it were for all the different areas, but we were able to have a discussion about its content. And I think that what that showed me was that there was specific consideration being given to GBV. So yes, within a wider human rights context, and yes, weighted within the kind of analysis that they were doing, but to even have that very specific around gender and gender-based violence and the proposed transfer, I thought showed that that was a solid kind of concrete implementation of a desire to fulfill their 7.4 obligations really clearly. So that definitely spoke to me in terms of the research and the interviews that we did as a standout example.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is not so much a best practice, but an attitude that I think all of the officials we spoke to came to the question of how to do the GBV risk assessment with a really constructive and positive attitude and a willingness to learn. So I think that seeing that type of attitude was very encouraging, and I hope that that's one that licensing officers everywhere would have towards this question.
Thanks, Anna. I think you're right. Political will and sort of a willingness to undertake this kind of exercise is really important, because if there isn't the commitment to undertake these kinds of assessments, we can have all the paper and text that we want, and we won't see any results. We have some questions in the Q&A. I'm going to split the first one. Actually, the first two questions actually have two questions within them. So I'm going to ask one at a time, even within those questions. So the first one is about whether effective implementation of Article 7.4 also needs having better gender balance in the bodies that assess arms exports related risks and licenses requests, or also a more gender balanced representation in ATT related processes and bodies. So do you also need sort of more balance within the organizations or the structures that are making these licensing decisions? So we'll start with that one and then I'll come back to the others.
I can jump in. I think it's an aspiration for all the work we do that there is more gender balance, and I think we see that where there is gender balance, better decisions get made in general, because it isn't all the same people talking to each other in the same room. I think effective implementation of 7.4, I have heard male licensing officers talk really well about how they want to do this and how they approach it. So I think it's gender champions can be men and women. Yes, I would like to see more balance. It is particularly weak in the disarmament field. UNIDIR have done some very interesting statistical analysis on this, and I think that there is a view to continue doing that analysis. The ATT Secretariat has also been charged with mapping the gender split between delegations, but also looking at the head of delegation. So are we just seeing lots of more junior level female officials in the room, or are they speaking, and are they in leadership roles? So I know Emma and her team have been really involved in this in their work in the International Gender Champions. Maybe there's something you could add also.
Yeah, just to add to Verity's point, this is, like she said, this is an endemic issue across all of disarmament. The representation of women in all of these forums, particularly on the export sides, is quite low. So having, while it's not specifically embedded within Article 7.4, having those perspectives, I think, is vital in terms of keeping communication lines there, keeping conversation going. And we know just from general gender studies that having women at a table influences policy and decision making in different ways. Particularly in the context of the ATT, the decision I mentioned from CSP 5 had two other aspects which specifically mentioned improving gender representation within the context of the ATT. So it's a problem that's been noted and identified by states, and I think it's something that we need to have a focus on to make sure we improve the situation. And simply by having a diversity of opinion and diversity of perspectives, we can improve export licensing from that vein as well.
Yeah, and I think just a sort of additional point to make on this would be that a goal of the questionnaire is to help licensing officers to identify other resources within their governments that they might not automatically reach to, who have expertise on questions of GBV and gender. So to have them regularly as a practice reach out to other parts of their government or other information sources that are focused more specifically on GBV, and build up the relationships between those parts of government so that they are contributing effective and useful information into the licensing process.
Great, thank you. I think you all sort of touched on the fact that the ATT is relatively new and it's still a very young treaty. And so one of the questions is how, or do you think that Article 7.4 has already had an impact on states' practices in assessing GBV related risks? And I wonder if you have an example of a particular aspect or where you've seen that be the case.
I'm going to say yes as my overall answer to that question. I think we have a long way to go. But even when Emma mentioned the Irish paper that was put forward asking for more work to be done on 7.4 within the ATT process, the ATT had only maybe a year or two previous to that established all of its working groups, had set up its model of working, had figured out how it was going to organise itself as a treaty. And then to go straight into an issue that is at the heart of risk assessment, really. It isn't one of the kind of easier edge issues of the treaty. It's the heart of it. You know, how are we going to look at this topic? Meant that states, it was very good that you did that, because it meant that it gave time within the CSP process for states to be discussing this. And I remember one of those working group meetings in particular where the Swedish facilitator asked for comments about how might we do something, what might we do? And there were only two speakers before silence in the room, and that was Ireland and that was the Control Arms Coalition. Nobody else spoke at the time about gender or GBV, and that might have been through a worry about getting it wrong, about saying the wrong thing, a worry about interpretation of what it meant for their licensing processes. Were they doing it right? Did they know? Did they have the information in that room to be able to share? And they didn't. But what then happened is everybody had to go away and get it and come back to the next meeting to have a much fuller discussion and to bring ideas and to bring ways forward. And so bit by bit, we get to build that. But if you think about the ATT, yes, I mentioned it was a long time being created, but it was still relatively short for a new international treaty of its size and magnitude. And the fact that we are now at a place where we're having detailed discussions about how to implement this new part of a new treaty, I think is pretty good. Yes, I would like it to be quicker, but it's also fine, as long as we don't take our foot off the pedal. And I think maybe here I will reference the fact that so much good work was done during CSP5, and the President's paper came through and it had targets and things for states, parties and civil society to contribute to the process, and then nothing happened. And I think we can't go into another CSP cycle without figuring out where is gender, how are we relating it to all of the working groups? It doesn't just sit in WGETI for effective treaty implementation. It should be across the whole treaty process. I went off on a bit of a tangent then, but I think it is related to the question about whether the treaty is,
No, I think it's an appropriate answer. It actually leads, and I apologize to our questioners. I'm not going to go in order because there's a question that fits naturally in with what you just said, and that is a question from the NATO Stability Policing Center of Excellence in Vicenza. And it says, what kind of reporting would you expect from NATO in this respect? Would it be the gender advisor to communicate instances of GBV? And the reason I think it's a particularly salient question is because you're talking about the need for this to really be a whole of government approach, that we're talking to a variety of information sources, and we need to think probably a bit more expansively than just individual government sources. So I think this is a great question for all of you, is how do we engage with not just the NATO Stability Policing Center, but how do we engage with other stakeholders in this process to ensure that the information is getting into the hands of the people that need it?
I think we're all hesitating because it's such a huge question, Rachel. I guess, I mean, coming into this work a few years ago, I sort of assumed there was some background network or some background thing that was happening that I just didn't know about, where all this information was already being shared and collated. And to sort of discover that it is really very ad hoc at the moment. I mean, obviously there are formal information sharing mechanisms, but specifically in relation to GBV, having just a kind of more general awareness across international organisations, including NGOs, that there is this provision within the ATT that they can be feeding into export licensing decisions in particular states. They can be proactively sending information, and they can look to the questionnaire to figure out what might be helpful to a licensing officer in a particular state. They don't have to wait for a request to sort of say, hey, I've noticed some trends in your exports and here are some thoughts that I have. Maybe that's a bit optimistic, but that's some initial thoughts there.
Yeah, I might just hop in on that as well. Ireland is not a NATO country, so I can't speak specifically on the NATO experience, but I think in terms of facilitating information exchange on gender issues is incredibly important. And one benefit of EU membership is that when we have concerns around these kind of questions, we can consult other member states. And I think that's something we need to normalize across the ATT network and between states who are engaging in these kind of exchanges. At the moment, like Anna and Verity were about saying, the communication, it can be quite ad hoc between states, and it can it can be based very heavily on personal relationships between individual officers. So I think that's something we need to normalize. Specifically in terms of whether or not it's up to a gender advisor, I think we need to, the more we can break this out of a box and the more we can mainstream it as a horizontal priority across different avenue work streams, I think the more effective this kind of implementation is going to be.
Let me ask you a question about, again, best practice. And one of the questions is, have you come across best practices of accounting for GBV against LGBTQI+, in particular trans people? So we think often when we have these conversations about gender, we think often about sort of men, women, but obviously there are others that are impacted by violence about sexual identity. So and gender identity. I'm wondering if in the research and in the project, you've come across any best practices.
Thank you for the question. One of the things that we have been trying to do through our work and will continue to do is to widen the understanding of the definition of gender-based violence, both in terms of the scope of weaponry we're talking about, that we have been in arms trade treaty meetings where governments have said, oh, it's only small arms that perpetrate or commit or facilitate gender-based violence. We do not agree with that analysis. We think that a multitude of the weaponry contained within the scope of the treaty can be used to commit or facilitate GBV. And also we can come across the view that gender-based violence is something that is only perpetrated against women and girls, rather than it having other sectors and groups of people that can be affected. I've not seen any good practices around this, but I think we weren't asking those types of questions specifically in the research. We were talking about risk analysis in a broader way to see what came back to us. I know that there are some really interesting projects going on within civil society at the moment, looking at policing in this area and looking at how our pride protests around the world policed. Is it in a different way to other protests, let's say, and I think more and more work is being done in that area, but we believe that it is something that should absolutely be taken into account in the same way that violence against women and girls should. So let's hope that we can continue together to expand that definition and challenge any views that try and shorten it, because it wasn't written as violence against women and children. Violence against women and children is part of 7.4, but it is gender-based violence that we're talking about.
And I do think that was very sort of forward thinking by the drafters, right? To have an expansive definition, not to be as limited. And so one of the questions is, do we know about a state that has already used Article 7.4 to deny a license? I know that we don't have states report on denials as part of the ATT process, but do we know, has a state in your interviews, did they come forward and say, actually, when we utilized our process, we were able to deny a license based solely on 7.4?
The answer to that one is no. And the question was asked in several ATT working group meetings as well. Can any state share their experience about this? And there wasn't anybody in the room who could. But I think what we should bear in mind when we hear that no is that often diversion will come up as a threat of why the transfer should be denied before they would get to even the human rights assessment. So it may be that, yes, it is prevalent in that country, but the weapons were not going to be transferred there anyway because there was another threat that was identified first that kind of stopped the process at that point. It's another thing I've asked a few governments for is, would you share with us, you know, what you deny on the numbers of diversion, the numbers of 6, 7, etc. Again, we're not able to get some of that information, and transparency is one of the kind of cornerstones of this treaty. And it would be wonderful if we could get to a place where more of that information was shared so that more organisations like Stimson and others could assist by the work we do. We did get some detailed information, but obviously not to the extent that would really help us, I think, going forward. I know that takes a lot, and the relationships within the EU and the denial notification sharing is brilliant. The ATT will take a lot longer to get to a place of that if they ever can. But those are the sorts of things, that information sharing, that transparency. This is supposed to be a global framework that is going to solve a global problem. So the way to do that is to all play together as a team.
Verity, you mentioned small arms and the belief that it is small arms that are really the main weapons that are used to commit GBV. And we do know that it's sort of the easiest, I'm going to put easiest in quotation marks, to count and to recognize. So one of the questions is, there's often, when we do GBV research, there's often a lack of actionable specifics about which firearms are used, such as the make or model, or even the general type. And so the question is, would it be useful to launch an effort supporting civil society organizations in gathering more detailed information about arms and GBV? So when we're sort of doing which would then also, to your point, Verity, expand potentially that list of weapons that are used, so that we don't solely have a small arms focus. And when we're making those export licensing decisions, we're able to look, again, holistically at the range of weapons that are used, not solely small arms and light weapons. So I think it's an interesting question in terms of how do we build upon the research that we have, the gaps that we have in our knowledge, and the ability to sort of develop some practical tools to address this issue.
Yes, I think, you know, of course that would be interesting. I'm also worried that there's a trap that we can fall into here. You know, risk assessment is forward-looking, and it's about what harm might be created. And quite often we are told by governments we have to prove the exact weapon, the route it took, that it was perpetrated in a particular violation, and that violation is documented and stuff. And it's like, well, yes, but no. You know, can you prove to us that this isn't going to be happening? And if there is a likelihood it will, example, French armoured vehicles going to Egypt at a time of huge internal repression that were then used for forced disappearances, virginity testing, all sorts of things. It was quite likely that that would be the case. And yet we didn't have the evidence to prove it in advance, and so the weapons kept flowing. I think that there's yes, let's do that detailed work, let's collect all of that information, but also we have to be careful about falling into a trap of, if we have to evidence the past violations to that extent, and it's very difficult and it's very expensive to do so. There are some brilliant organisations, Conflict Armament Research, who through big EU funded projects do that type of work. But even for them, with their expert team of weapons identifiers, country researchers, financial wizards who track the money and see where everything's gone, it's really hard. So I think stronger risk assessment based on forward-looking risk is probably a better way to spend that energy. So just be careful of the trap. It's a trap.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree that it isn't a question of assigning liability for past acts, but thinking about what are the risks going forward, knowing what we know about the situation in the state and the end user. I think, though, if someone would like to coordinate this effort to get CSOs to understand how to document connections between arms and GBV, that would be incredibly helpful. As Verity says, it's such a resource-intensive process, but if it's something that's built into the ordinary work of an organisation that's reporting on GBV, that it's an extra question they ask in different contexts, that would be so helpful to establishing that evidence base and showing the harm and the direct connections between arms and GBV in a very tangible way.
Yeah, I think what you both sort of referred to is sort of the mainstreaming of this issue as part of the regular review process, as part of regular conversations on disarmament issues, regular conversations in terms of looking at policy, arms transfer policies towards specific countries, that it's not an afterthought, right? It should be integrated into the larger holistic process. Having it as a separate article in the ATT allows us that entry point, but I think success will really be when this is part of the process and not in addition to the regular process. And that's one of the questions that we have from an audience member, is that you noted, Verity, the Canadian example, and it says it's interesting to hear of the consideration of GBV by the Canadian Export Permit Licensing Authorities, but it hasn't, for example, led to any curtailment of exports to Saudi Arabia for equipment implicated in GBV in Yemen. And the audience member says, the reason appears to be that Canada requires a very direct connection between the export in question and the harm, and they do not appear to give any effect to the facilitation role of a particular export. And I think this is sort of a definitional question or a implementation question for many states, is making that link between the weapons export and the facilitation of that GBV. So the questionnaire said, this should be tremendous. The value of the questionnaire is tremendous to those working to do advocacy within governments. But asking for any comments you have on how to draw that link or how to make that more explicit as government officials consider particular exports.
I think in the case of Canada, they are very active as an international gender champion, and played a role in several of the debates when this work was going on. So go and have the conversation about facilitation again. There's amazing civil society groups in Canada. I know that you have a strong network, and I think that, yes, please do use the questionnaire and go and have that discussion. And we will also, as soon as working group meetings are happening again, go and have a conversation and ask those questions directly ourselves with our Canadian colleagues.
There's an additional question, and Verity, I think you mentioned it very early in your initial remarks about the other processes that are happening where there are opportunities to link the work that the ATT is doing. And one of the questions concerns how other international organizations or other international processes could be brought into this conversation. So I'm wondering if the panelists, if any of you have suggestions about how we link up with other efforts, other processes, so that, again, we don't just have this as a carve out in the ATT and that's all that states are thinking about, but they're really implementing this throughout their process.
Emma, do you want to talk about yours and then I'll talk about mine?
Yeah, I think the obvious one, at least in the context of small arms, is the BMS on this coming up this summer for the UN Programme of Action in Small Arms. I think there's a huge opportunity there for us to engage and get direct language concerning GBV in arms. It's a gap in the architecture at the moment that I think we can address, and having this kind of guidance and being able to, I think it was implied earlier that there's a certain fear in terms of tackling these kind of issues, that GBV as a concept can be overwhelming to discuss, and it cuts across so many facets. So having practical guidance and a proof of concept in terms of how we can apply this in a practical, real way takes the fear element out of it. So I think the UNPOA is an obvious one. Colleagues will be aware, obviously, as well, that Ireland is engaging in the political declaration process on a WIPA at the moment, and I think that's a forum in which we're seeing more and more discussion in terms of the gender impacts of explosive weapons. So that's another area in which there's an ongoing conversation. We've seen gender references also, and a gender reference was included in the TPNW, which is the first time a link directly drawn to in the case of nuclear weapons. So we're definitely seeing a normalization of this process. One thing we have found in our experience in Ireland is that raising these issues early in a consultation process, raising them frequently and keeping them on the agenda is incredibly important. It's not that there's a lack of will, it's just that it's making sure that we continue to name the problem, because that's a big part of this. It's that, GBV, there's a whole raft of human rights concerns in many contexts, but GBV oftentimes falls under the radar purely because we haven't named the problem. So drawing attention to it, I think, is incredibly important. So getting in early and hammering the point to the point where your colleagues are saying Ireland's off on a thing about GBV again, it gets the point across, I think, quite effectively. So those would be UNPOA, the WIPA discussions is an ongoing development, and recent success in the TPNW are just some examples of how we can keep this in the fort going forward.
And I think the one I'll add to that is the current formation of the GGE looking at the regulation.
Verity, we can't hear you.
Can you not hear me? I'm unmuted. Is that any better? Yes, okay, thank you. I would agree with all of those, and I would add at a very early stage now, there is a GG forming to look at the tools of torture and death penalty. And I think that there is another opportunity there when we are considering how to regulate standard issue police kits like batons and handcuffs and things that have a legitimate purpose, but if misused, the treatment can amount to torture or other ill treatment. And there is definitely a discrimination and a GBV aspect to that, which I think we can be looking at this really early stage as the group of government experts prepares its report for the next round of UNGA.
Thanks. I recognize that we're running short of time, and I know there are some additional questions, but I always like to keep you wanting more. And so there's many opportunities to continue to engage in this conversation. But I do want to give our panelists one last opportunity to make any final thoughts that they may have. And then, of course, all of our panelists will be available. You can reach out to them if you have additional follow-up questions. So I'll start with Emma. I'll just go in the order you presented if you have a final thought.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I just want to reiterate that we're incredibly proud to be able to continue to support this kind of work. I think it's incredibly important for the effective implementation of the ATT in terms of breaching information asymmetries within the ATT and getting all states on the same page. And I think it's an incredibly useful toolkit, which I'm already handing out to all of my colleagues in terms of how they should be conducting their assessments. So it's already being applied, and just strongly urge all audience members to go read the report. It's incredibly useful, it's incredibly practical, and a huge amount of work has gone into it. So I'd also like to thank Stimson and Harvard for all of the work that you've put in over the last year.
Thanks, Emma. Anna, over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. And again, I can only just thank Stimson for this wonderful partnership, and again, Ireland for supporting the work so much. I guess just reflecting on some of the questions and some of the topics that came up. One thing that when I first came to this work I found surprising was how unusual it is for exports to actually be denied. That the more usual thing that happens is that exports are approved, and often that's because there's been a dialogue between the licensing officer and the exporter in advance, so it hasn't even reached the formal application stage. But still, this is a space where the presumption seems to be that exports proceed unless something is proven to show that they shouldn't proceed. And I think a lot of this work is about trying to challenge that presumption, and particularly in relation to this topic, where there needs to be this very focused on the effects of weapons on the lives of human beings. And here we're speaking about the effects of weapons on people who experience violence and discrimination because of their gender and sex. So I'm so proud and happy of this really vital work, and thanks.
Thank you, Verity.
Thanks, Rachel. And I guess I'd start in my closing remarks as saying, we're approaching the 6th anniversary of the Yemen conflict, the worst humanitarian crisis that is going. And we have to recognise that a change in political leadership can make the interpretation of existing legislation change from a yes to a no overnight when it comes to transfers into that type of context. So the export regimes we have are good. They're not perfect, but they are good. But they rely on political will to interpret them with the same determination that we saw states put forward when they created the ATT as something to reduce human suffering and create this international regulatory framework. So I do believe that the ATT has a role to play in addressing human rights harms and reducing gender-based violence, but that also depends upon political will. So civil society has a massive continuing role to play in all of this. We will continue to produce helpful, practical guides that do that, but ultimately we need our leaders to make decisions about the most difficult of cases and make the right decisions so that weapons flows will stop when it is just so evident that all they're being used to do is create harm. And also delighted to have worked on this project. Thank you, Anna, Rachel, Emma, for being brilliant to work with. It's a tricky subject, but I've had a lot of fun as well. And during the COVID year, it has been so nice to be connected with such a dedicated, smart group of women. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Verity. And I want to end sort of on a personal note, because I think we've been talking about GBV really at a global level and in general terms, sort of this amorphous concept. But I really want to highlight that GBV is a very personal and very individual issue. And this big picture conversation sort of puts state complicity at the forefront, which is absolutely the case, but it's really individuals that are perpetrators and individuals that are affected. So I don't want to lose sight of that, particularly because in just the last week, we've heard about the case of Sarah Everard in the UK, the murders in Atlanta that targeted Asian women. And we often see the objectification of women ending in gender violence. We know that the global pandemic has only made cases of violence against women even more acute. So I want to just take a moment and honor those of you who have experienced this violence, who have been affected by this violence. We know that GBV affects so many people around the world. And so as we acknowledge our efforts to mitigate GBV globally, we must also think about what we can do for our friends, for our families, for our colleagues, for each other, for ourselves. And so I'm really proud that Stimson has been part of this, and that we have such valued partners that can make a contribution to stopping this violence. And I look forward to continuing to work with our civil society and government partners to encourage real change. So thank you for allowing me the opportunity to be part of this project. It has really, as Verity said, it's been such a meaningful year of work that I think really does have the potential to have real impact. So thank you, Anna, Verity, Emma, for your great work today, but your great work throughout the year and for years to come, and all of the partners that we have. I just want to also highlight an event next week. If you really enjoy this kind of practical tools to implement the ATT, we have another event on Thursday next week at the same time, 9:30 Eastern Daylight Time, that will look at practical tools for addressing the risk of weapons diversion. Also has a little questionnaire in there for licensing officers. So really a partnered effort supported by Ireland that we can share with all of you. So thank you all for joining us this morning, this afternoon, this evening. We're really pleased that we were able to engage so many of you in this important topic, and I wish you all continued safety and resilience. Thank you so much.